What's up, Earth Rockers? It's your boy Shovatar here, making a video that's pretty different from any of the videos that I made in the past, but it's necessary given the surrounding context of what I've been posting recently. This is going to be a tier list detailing all of the DSS cards in Circle of the Moon. Something I have to explain right off the bat is that this is going to be a list constructed with the assumption that playing in rather vampire killer mode or shooter mode or thief mode, i.e., not magician mode. What that means is that I'm assuming that you are not going to have all these from the start, and you're going to have to get them. And I'm going to take that into account when I do my ranking. The word for this is availability, and availability is exactly what it sounds like. It's when is this card available, and how practically attainable is this card. Those are two factors that I'm going to look at for some of them. So to illustrate my point right off the bat, Unicorn and Black Dog are both going in garbage tier because they are only available in the arena. And if you can clear the arena, you can kill Dracula. So once you can get these cards, you already have whatever tools you need to complete the game, and they are completely superfluous to that objective. Obviously, if this was about Magician mode, that is not where I would rank them, but this isn't about Magician mode. This is about the default base game. So in keeping with the theme of availability, Mercury, I'm going to put in good tier. Mercury is not great. Mercury is sort of a mediocre offensive option, but you get it for free. You basically always have it. It has a very high drop chance. You're going to have it at the start of the game. So I'm ranking it up here. Venus is the first must farm card. I would say Venus is a must farm um, because there are other cards that you're going to want to farm. And Venus Mandragora buffs your luck, which makes the farming much easier. Also, Venus Manticore is really good. Venus Manticore doubles the hearts that you get from heart drops, which means you have more ammo for your crucifix or your boomerang, which means more actual damage being dealt, because the boomerang is how you want to deal damage, it's how you're going to deal damage in Circle of the Moon. A couple of other Venus combos are incidentally useful. Venus Thunderbird can be good in the late game for one-shotting things. Venus Salamander is sort of like the first practically available good offensive option that um, doesn't have any real drawbacks except that it drains your MP pretty fast. But the main thing is Venus Mandragora, Venus Manticore. Those are both really good. Jupiter is, in my opinion, the single best card in the entire game. Jupiter Serpent or Jupiter Manticore will single-handedly trivialize Dromelech and Death and Camilla, three entire bosses in a game with very hard bosses that are all totally solved by a good Jupiter card. And as if that's not enough, you also have Jupiter Mandragora, which, although it is extremely tedious to actually utilize, does give you a much-needed source of healing in a very difficult, very punishing game. So Jupiter is probably the single best card in the entire game. Mars was a card that I had under Must Farm at first, but I had it under Must Farm because the Mars card, Mars Mandragora or Mars Salamander specifically, were integral to my strategy for killing the zombie dragon. But since I've since discovered that there are other ways to kill the zombie dragon, I'm going to put Mars in good. Mars is a good card because Mars Mandragora and Mars Salamander are just consistent offensive options that increase your range of attack, because those both give you overhand swing swords. Well, Mars Serpent does the same thing, but Mars Serpent isn't really good as an offensive option. Mars Serpent is really only good for climbing brain floats. Whereas Mars Salamander and Mars Mandragora let you swing overhand, which makes it easier to hit flying enemies, which is super important, and also lets you hit enemies through the floor. So if there are enemies that are too dangerous to approach head on, you can come at them from a completely safe angle with either of those two combinations. There are other Mars card combos too, but I honestly don't know much about them. I think Mars Thunderbird lets you like punch things, which seems like it's really bad because you have to get closer to them. And Circle of the Moon does not have very fluid, uh, easily controlled movement. So I think closing distance is generally a bad idea. Uh, but just based on my knowledge of Mars Salamander, Mars Mandragora, this is where I would put it. Then you have the Diana card. Diana is, I guess I would say it's mediocre. If this was Magician mode, I'd be putting the Diana card in the highest possible tier, because what the Diana card does is the Diana card lets you shoot projectiles out of your whip, and the projectiles do a ton of damage, but they're very, very draining to your mana. And in Magician mode, where you have increased intelligence, you have higher mana, higher max mana, better mana regeneration. That's not a problem. In Magician mode, Diana is what saves you from not doing any damage because she provides an actual viable offensive option. But in the base game in Vampire Killer, and this is even worse in shooter mode than thief mode, you just don't have the mana to consistently utilize her. Diana Griffin is like the single most powerful offensive option in the entire game, barring any Uranus cards. But like it's just so hard to utilize. And plus, the thing about Diana cards in general is that they're so expensive and they do so much damage that it's tough to really justify using them on anything except for bosses. And in most bosses in the game that are actually all bosses in the game that are available past the first place you can get Diana, which is I believe in the underground caverns. None of those bosses are really, it's not practical to utilize her against any of those bosses because the zombie dragon, you're just never going to be in the right position to hit him with any Diana projectiles. I mean, maybe after one of them is dead, you could maybe hit the second one, but like the way they move their heads around is like so fast and so weird. You would have to like be aiming at something you could only half see on your screen, and it just seems like a great way to miss a bunch of times and run out of mana and have to just wait to engage them again. And then of course, Death and Camilla, you want Jupiter cards for those, and Hugh is never going to let you get far away enough to hit him with Diana Griffin. Dracula, maybe phase 2 of Dracula, but like phase 1 of phase 2 of Dracula is not really the hard part. It's phase 2 of phase 2 when he turns into the eyeball and is flying around. And that's another trying to aim at a very small target situation, which seems like it's kind of a recipe for failure. So Diana is an interesting card and it has pros and cons, but it's only very situationally useful. And I can't think of many of those situations in general. Apollo, which is the next card, I'm gonna put it under garbage tier because for one thing, it has worse availability than Diana in terms of how both Diana and Apollo would be very annoying to farm if they were mandatory. But I feel like I've seen Diana naturally drop like 4 times as often as I've seen Apollo naturally drop. And once you get Apollo, like it doesn't do anything that special. Diana is interesting because the Diana projectiles do so much damage, but the Apollo cards give you access to like you can throw like magical projectiles, but the none of the projectiles do the same kind of jaw-dropping damage that the Diana projectiles do, and you have to do a button combo in order to utilize them. And that's super important because it means it's hard to do them in mid-air. With Diana, it's like you jump, you swing, you just shoot in midair. But in Apollo, I feel like you can mostly only use the Apollo spells on the ground, which severely limits their usefulness. And once you use them, all you're doing is you're throwing a thing that does a pretty good chunk of damage to an enemy that's just in front of you on the ground. And that's already what the boomerang does. And the boomerang doesn't cost any mana, and you don't have to do any weird button combos in order to utilize them. And you can just get the boomerang. You don't have to like try to get it to drop because Apollo drops off of like the demon lord enemies, which are not that plentiful. Whereas the Diana, you go through like a big string of enemies in the underground caverns that can drop it. So Apollo, I think, is pretty terrible. Neptune, I would say is more like Diana, where there are a couple of places in the game where it's really useful, but it's mostly either unnecessary or redundant. Neptune is a defensive card. Neptune gives you immunity to certain elemental attacks based on the element card you pair with it, like Neptune Salamander makes you immune to fire attacks. Neptune Serpent makes you immune to ice attacks. It's slightly more complicated than that. It doesn't make you literally immune. What it does is it means that if you get hit with that kind of attack, it will detract the damage from your mana instead of your health. So in practical terms, it's immunity. Um, the thing about the Neptune card is that most elemental attacks in the game are projectiles. And if you want to deal with projectiles, Jupiter Serpent or Jupiter Manticore are way better at it than that, and you can get Jupiter way earlier than Neptune. Neptune's first available in the underground waterway, and it comes from the ice armors, which are pretty tricky to farm, although that's not really something that I'm factoring into this. But that being said, there are a few niche instances where Neptune is really useful, specifically the Ice Demon in the Underground Waterway. Putting on Neptune Serpent is basically the only way to guarantee that you can't take damage from him, because Jupiter Manticore doesn't cut it because you destroy his projectiles and then more projectiles um, fragment off of that and just hit you. So Neptune Serpent is good in a couple situations. Neptune Cockatrice actually is good in the Dracula fight because Dracula's comet attack, which is the hardest attack for him of his to dodge in in the first phase of phase 2, is stone based damage. So Neptune Cockatrice can protect you from that, but again, at that point in the game, you should probably have better tools to deal with Dracula. So at no point in the game is Neptune really mandatory, and it's very situationally useful otherwise. Another thing to keep in mind in terms of the Neptune-Jupiter comparison is that Jupiter Serpent or Jupiter Manticore will protect you from all kinds of projectiles no matter what. But with Neptune, if you're dealing with different enemies with different kinds of projectiles, you need to screw around and do more menuing to swap from like Neptune Serpent to Neptune Salamander or something like that. So I would say Neptune, generally speaking, is not that good. If Black Dog was available before the observation tower, then Neptune Black Dog would be really good, because then Neptune Black Dog would help you against the Dark Arms for Hue. And actually, a Neptune Cockatrice might be good to deal with the towers in the observation towers that can like petrify you. But again, that's like a very small, very situational thing, and you're better off just killing them, honestly. So Neptune is cool. It's more interesting, but I still can't really put it above mediocre and good conscience. Saturn is garbage. It's kind of in the same boat as Unicorn and Black Dog, where the availability is just terrible. In fact, I would say Saturn is probably the worst card in the entire chart because of its availability and because of its redundancy. So Saturn is available from an enemy right before the battle arena. You can access this area anytime after you get the Roc Wing, so it's not until very late game that you can even get him. And in order to get him, you have to farm an enemy that flies around a lot and does a ton of damage and is very dangerous. And farming those enemies is extremely difficult without the Uranus card, and Uranus is just better than Saturn in every way. So if you already have the Uranus card, there's no reason to get Saturn. You can't get Saturn until the end of the game, and it's just pointless. And once you get it, it doesn't even do anything that wouldn't already be doable by anything else. Saturn, well, I should say what it does. Saturn gives you familiars that like follow you around and presumably like kill things. But again, if you want to kill things, you probably already have the Uranus card. If you don't have the Uranus card, now you're going to spend however much time it takes farming this really obnoxious enemy. It's going to take forever, and it's not going to give you anything. And it's at the end of the game, so it's like, who cares? It doesn't matter. So this card is terrible. This is the worst God card, or whatever it's called in the entire game. Uranus is one of the best. Uranus lets you summon enemies that show up and do a bunch of damage to everything on the screen. It's like a summon from like Final Fantasy or something. And this is basically the last word in offensive options in Circle of the Moon. Once you get the Uranus card, regular enemies are just sort of like, it's just sort of a question of how many Uranus cards it takes to kill them. That you can kill them safely and consistently is now no longer a question. And this is especially important for farming the Dark Armor, because the Dark Armor, like the Saturn card, drops from an enemy that's very dangerous and flies around very fast, but the Dark Armor is actually good and actually worth getting, unlike Saturn. So you need Uranus for that if you want to clear out the arena. If you don't want to clear out the arena, then I would say Uranus is irrelevant. But if you do, then you want the Dark Armor, and if you want the Dark Armor, you want Uranus, and that's just kind of how it goes. It's one of those, it's like a chain of dominoes falling over. Pluto is unfortunately in much more of the same kind of situation as Unicorn and Black Dog are, where Saturn is in a similar bad spot in terms of availability. Its availability is slightly better than Black Dog and Unicorn, but it's just useless. Pluto is good. Pluto does a lot of interesting things. It gives you like permanent buffs. Well, not permanent buffs, buffs that like detract from your mana, but like interesting augmentations to your character that are all really impactful and powerful. Again, the problem is when you get it. You can't get it until the end of the game, and Uranus is already available, and there's no point in going for Pluto when you could go for Uranus instead. So unfortunately, it's just not worth getting. And you get Uranus and Pluto in almost the same way. You have to farm mimic candle enemies that appear in a boss room late in the game. So it's very unfortunate because I think the Pluto card is really cool and does a lot of interesting things. Like Pluto Salamander, I think gives you access to item crashes, and then Pluto Manticore increases your XP gains, which can be good in the late game. But outside of Magician mode, it's just not that good. So those are the God cards. Uh, then we get to the element cards. Element cards, Salamander is in exactly the same position as Mercury, where Salamander, I'll be honest with you, is not that good, but you get it for free. The thing about Salamander that makes it not that good is that, yes, it is the first element card that you are going to get probably in the entire game, but in the Catacombs, a lot of enemies are resistant to fire damage. So you get Mercury Salamander in the Catacombs, it's like the first utilization of the DSS system you're going to get, and then the Mercury Salamander Flame Whip is doing less damage to enemies than the regular whip would do. So I think that's pretty bad, and I think they probably should have changed that, but that's not really the point. The point is just that Salamander is available for free. That automatically makes it good. Um, Jupiter Salamander is okay. It creates two like rotating fireballs that if you really don't have any other cards and you really don't want to farm for any other cards, then like if that's the only defensive option available for you, that's like better than nothing, honestly, on a Dramalek. So that's okay. Mars Salamander, I already talked about, pretty good. Diana Salamander is, I think, the most affordable of the Diana projectiles, and it's good in the fittingly, it's good in the same series of rooms where you can get the Diana card, because the Diana card drops in the long, like I said, the long hallways in the underground caverns with the plant monsters and the killer bees. And Diana Salamander is good at hitting the killer bees before they can get to you if you don't want to pick up the dagger. So that's that's pretty good. Um, that's all I have to say about Salamander. Serpent is one of the trickier cards to rank because it's not great at anything. It's not like the best at anything, except for for climbing brain floats, and its availability is better than almost every other card, but that has to come with a caveat where it's like theoretical availability. I'm going to put it in good tier anyway, and I'm going to explain what I mean by theoretical availability. Technically speaking, the Serpent card drops from Earth Demons, and you fight your first Earth Demon in the Catacombs. So this could be the second card you ever get, and if that was more consistent, then I think I would have absolutely no qualms with putting this in good tier. The reason I'm hesitant is because there aren't that many Earth Demons you can get it from, and it doesn't become available again until the underground warehouse where it drops from the holy armors, and at that point you already could have gotten Manticore. So I don't know. But because Jupiter Serpent is like almost as good as Jupiter Manticore, and because Serpent lets you climb brain floats as nothing else, which nothing else lets you do, it's kind of like a lot of small benefits that I think keep it out of being bad. Climbing brain floats is never really mandatory, but it's good to be able to do if you're doing an efficient route through the game, because that way you don't have to. Because at the end of the underground warehouse, you're spit back out into the catacombs, and there's an area of the catacombs you can only get to by either climbing brain floats or using the Roc Wing. But once you get out, when you get spit out of the underground warehouse, you don't have the Roc Wing yet. So if you want to clear out the catacombs right after the underground warehouse, which is the most efficient thing to do, you need to be able to climb brain floats. So that's what the Serpent is good at. Other card combos, I don't really know anything about the rest of the about like Apollo Serpent or Diana Serpent or whatever. But I will also say the Neptune Serpent, like I mentioned, is one of the few is like the most concrete use of Neptune that I can think of involves the Ice Demon. So that makes Serpent, I would say, pretty good overall. Mandragora must farm, no question. Mandragora probably the single best element card in the entire game, with only a few competitors because of everything that I already said. Venus Mandragora, luck, farming. Jupiter Mandragora, healing, super important. Mercury Mandragora, better version of Mercury Salamander, because a bunch of enemies have resistances to fire, almost no enemies have resistances to plant damage. Mars Mandragora, better version of Mars Salamander, for the same reason, and because the Mars Mandragora sword has like a wake to it, like a little extra aura to the sword, which means that if you don't hit something directly with the sword, you might hit it with the aura and still do a little bit of damage. So can't say enough good things about the Mandragora card. It's excellent. It's excellent. Golem card, I think I would say mediocre because the Golem card, its availability isn't bad. You can first get it from the Thunder Skeletons in the Marble Gallery, but like it doesn't do anything that makes it like super attractive to me. The only thing that I know it does that can be sometimes useful is that I think Mercury Golem increases the range of your whip, which isn't bad. Like there are plenty of places in the game where I think that would be good, but it's not impactful and significant in the way that like Mars is, or the way that and it doesn't have the same like availability as Salamander. If Salamander wasn't free, I'd probably put it down here with Golem because Golem and Salamander kind of remind me of each other. Where it's like, yeah, this is good to have, but it doesn't really do anything. And most Golem card buffs are defensive, and in terms of defensive buffs, like if you're not using Jupiter Serpent or Jupiter Manticore, then like what are you doing? In my opinion, anyway. Um, Cockatrice, I would say, is garbage. Um, it's nice sometimes to be able to utilize like I mean, like I said, there's a couple uses of Neptune Cockatrice I can think of, but all other Cockatrice card combos are either just not as good as other options or are almost useless. Cockatrice is like Golem, where a lot of the benefits are defensive, but I've already talked about why there are better options for defensive benefits than literally just buffing your defense. If it comes down to it, you should just try to kill things before they can damage you. In that sense, Circle of the Moon is more like a classic Castlevania game where the emphasis should be on powerful offensive options, not just trying to like out tank everything the way that Alucard does, because Nathan's just not tanky enough to make that work most of the time. So Cockatrice, not good at all. Manticore, must farm, no question. Jupiter Manticore is the best Jupiter defensive shield option in the entire game. Technically, Jupiter Unicorn is better. It's the only shield that gives you like pretty literally guaranteed protection from all projectiles. But Manticore is like 99% guaranteed, 98% guaranteed. And unlike Unicorn, you can actually get Manticore before the game is literally over. So Manticore is incredibly good. Venus Manticore is something that I have on by default pretty much all the time in any of my non-magician mode runs because more hearts means more boomerangs means more damage, which is going back to what I was talking about a second ago, which is that you need to be able to do a bunch of damage to enemies in this game, or else they'll fucking farm you. Other Manticore combos, I don't even know anything about. I don't know what the hell Diana Manticore does. I don't know what Mercury Manticore does. I don't know what Mars Manticore does. Doesn't matter. I don't need to know. If it was just Jupiter Manticore, if it was just Jupiter Manticore and nothing else, I would still put it in must farm because that's how good it is. It's the better version of Jupiter Serpent that means that you don't have to worry about Adramelech, Death, or Camilla. Almost half the bosses in the game, one silver bullet, boom, that's it. Griffin. Griffin, I'm going to put in mediocre. The only thing that saves it from garbage tier is the fact that Diana Griffin is such a remarkable option for offense because it does so much damage. Like I can't emphasize to you guys how much damage Diana Griffin does. If you watch my magician mode footage, I use it to one shot the first boss and like three shot the second boss. And that's the Necromancer. That's like the most dangerous boss in the entire game, and it goes down in like a fucking second. And that's in magician mode, where and in Circle of the Moon, damage of DSS card combos is based off of strength, not intelligence. And that's in magician mode where your strength is nerfed, and I'm still like one-shotting bosses with it. That's how much damage this fucking thing does. But again, there are better options, generally speaking, for boss fights, which is the only reason why it's not in good or must farm. So it's useful in like a couple of very niche situations, but it's not generally applicable because of how exorbitant the mana cost is. That's what Griffin does. Other Griffin combos, I don't really know what a lot of other Griffin combos do. I think Pluto Griffin increases your movement speed, which is pretty neat. But again, that's Pluto, which is not no reason to get Pluto when Uranus exists. And finally, we have Thunderbird, which is a must farm because Uranus Thunderbird is the most mana efficient summon in the entire game. Uranus Thunderbird is the final tool that you need to beat the game. Uranus Thunderbird is what lets you farm the Dark Armor. It's what lets you utterly trivialize both phases of the second form of Dracula. It is just the button you push to win the game, and once you get it, you don't have anything else to worry about. So that simple fact that um, Thunderbird does to Dracula what Jupiter Manticore does to Death, Dromelech, and Camilla. And I can't state how important that is. And if you're having trouble with Hugh, same thing with Hugh. Just Uranus Thunderbird Hugh over and over again, and he's just not even, he might as well not even be in the game anymore. So anything that powerful, I think I have to put in must farm. And like I briefly mentioned before, Venus Thunderbird, which increases your damage based on percentage of map completion, can let you like run around one-shotting things in the late game, which can be very, very useful if you're doing things late game, running around, collecting last energy tanks you missed, or filling out the map. like what I ended up doing at the end of the game. So this is the tier. It's very, very pleasantly symmetrical, which may indicate good design or may just indicate luck on part of me and my opinions. I will say this too. I should have said this at the start, but I'm just going to say this now. I do not consider myself an expert in Circle of the Moon. I've played it several times. I think I have a good grasp on the usefulness of the individual cards, but there could 100% be things about the game that I don't know yet, and it's possible that this ranking, there are things in this ranking that are not accurate because they're just things that I don't know. So if someone out there, if there are people out there who see this who know more about the game than I do, I hope that these rankings at least make sense to you, even if you think I'm wrong about certain things. And if you don't know anything about Circle of the Moon, I hope that this should provide some insight on which cards you should go for and which cards are safe to ignore and to not worry about. And as a final note, trying to get 20 cards is pointless. Just don't do it. It's just not worth the time. It's not worth the effort. These are the six you need to focus on. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope it made sense. Keep on keeping on.